Hi everyone, welcome back to some more lore. I am going to be reacting to yet another Vati Elden Ring video because they are just masterpieces and they really help visually and audibly explain all of the lore and break it down for me in a digestible way. And I'm sure that's why you all love him as well. So I'll link this video in the description below so you can check it out if you haven't already. But otherwise, we are going to be checking out the lore of Malenia. And I'm very much looking forward to this because I have quite a few unanswered questions and things I want to know more about her and like why she fought Rodan and things like that and her relation to Rodan. And yeah, kind of go from there. So let's get into it. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe. We've obviously got the entire of the DLC to come, so subscribe and stay tuned for that. But otherwise, let's get into it. Okay.
The Scarlet Rot is one of the deadliest things in the lands between, for it
Pretty
has
messed
no real
up.
cure, and famously even the demigods could not stave off its effects.
Yeah, the fact that they could get infected.
No one told them about preserving boluses. Anyway, what's really interesting about the Scarlet Rot is that it's actually a very old legend, one that predates Malenia and all of the horrors found in Caelid.
Does it predate the Erd Tree?
To understand where it all began, we have to go below, to the Lake of Rot, where we can find a few item descriptions that speak of this time. For example, here in the southeastern corner, we can loot a crown of mushrooms.
Oh my god, I did not
forms
see
this
that.
towering headpiece, and it reads, "Long ago, great lords served the Scarlet Rot. Perhaps such fungal bodies served as their crowns."
Damn.
And the rest of this set is made up of the mushroom set, which are considered holy vestments for those enraptured by the Scarlet Rot
Damn.
that root them to the earth. So already we have this hierarchy of mushroom lords that served the Scarlet Rot back then, as well as worshippers who venerated it. And you might think it's strange that these beings might worship or serve a sickness, but the Scarlet Rot is so much more than that, because the Scarlet Rot is no mere disease. No, for proof of that, one only need look at the Crystallian. Crystallian are inorganic beings, and yet they can be afflicted by the rot just like any other. There's even some Crystallians that are infused with rot and can spread it to others as well.
Yes, I've been
because it's not
afflicted by rot by
just
one
a
of them.
disease. Instead, the map for the Lake of Rot calls it the divine essence of an outer god.
Creepy.
Something that was sealed away long ago in this underground world. And if you've been following Elden Ring lore for any length of time, you should be no stranger to the concept of an outer god. They are these indeterminable, abstract beings that impress an order or a will upon the world through their avatars, their servants, and their vessels.
They typically are
And
demigods
in
or
the case of the Scarlet
Empyreans.
Rot, its order is one of decay, where beings are put into a progressing state of death with the intent to achieve this glorious rebirth that will follow that process. The poison armament description tells us this, saying that those who dwell within poison know rot all too well, the death that begets life, that comes to all equally. That is to say, it is the cycle of rebirth put into practice.
It is a natural
A great example of this
life.
is Miquella's Halig tree, which might be completely dead were it not for the fungal growths that have sprouted upon the tree. And of course we also see this in Caelid, where flowers of the rot are on the very precipice of budding, despite all the decay. Of course, it's debatable whether this type of life is even desirable at all, but you can't argue that it is life. And the agents of the rot god certainly find it desirable, so they do their utmost to spark this sacred cycle of rebirth in others, infecting them with poison and rot, and putting this cycle of rebirth into practice.
So crazy.
On that note, there is one extremely curious item that you can find down in the Grand Cloister, and it's called the Scorpion Stinger. This is a dagger that's glistening with Scarlet Rot, and it's called a ceremonial tool, which I think means that any ceremony that used this dagger would have been a ceremony to stab and infect another being with the Scarlet Rot.
To bring upon
it would have been
Scarlet
a
Rot.
ceremony of spreading their treasured affliction to others. But what's really interesting about this dagger is that it's fashioned from a great scorpion's tail, and it's also specifically said to have been crafted from the relic of a sealed outer god. And When you consider that phrasing, it makes you realize that it's saying that this dagger was fashioned from a relic of the Rot god, who was also a great scorpion. That's what it sounds like it's saying.
Right. Okay. So
Many
the outer
historical
god
relics
is
in our history are often the physical remains of deceased saints or holy persons. So the god of Rot might really be, or at least might have manifested as, a great scorpion.
Yeah, manifested. I like that.
I guess the scorpion stinger is kind of like the eye of the fell god, or the three fingers of frenzy, or the whole winged theme that death has going on. It's a small remaining hint at the visual identity of these ephemeral outer gods that is intended to stimulate the imagination, even if we never truly find out what these outer gods look like.
Yeah. I love that the outer gods
truly is, it and its Scarlet Rot essence was eventually conquered, or sealed at least.
Sealed.
This was done by a legendary figure known as the Blind Swordsman. As the story goes, the Blind Swordsman was favored by a fairy called the Dancer in Blue. The fairy bestowed upon them a flowing curved sword, which was patterned after flowing water, and with this sword the Blind Swordsman sealed away an ancient god, a god that was Rot itself.
Yeah.
There's quite a bit to unpack in these descriptions. First, who or what was the fairy called the Blue Dancer? Well, I think that the warrior's blue cloth set gives us a clue. It reveals that the blue color of its fabric symbolizes brisk waters, and the cloth doll that represents the Blue Dancer is styled to look just like water. The description goes on to say that just as still waters turn foul, stagnation leads to decay, so warriors must remain ever drifting. It's essentially saying that flowing water is the very antithesis to Rot, which thrives in stagnant water.
Yeah, the opposite.
And I think, and this is just speculation, but I think that the Blue Fairy might essentially be a sort of river spirit. If you've ever seen Hayao Miyazaki's Spirited Away, then you might know what type of being I'm talking about. In that movie, just quickly, a stinking sludge monster comes to the bathhouse, where it is eventually revealed that it's actually a river spirit whose river was bogged down and corrupted by pollution.
Yeah.
But once his waters are unblocked, the river spirit is restored. And Elden Ring, by comparison, does also have two legendary rivers called the Shifra and the Ainzel.
Shifra, that's how you pronounce it.
What? Underground,
I've been butchering that.
The Scarlet Rot that was eventually sealed all that time ago. So I don't think that it's a stretch to think that the Blue Fairy might have occupied or might have been a supernatural extension of those underground rivers. I think it's a fun theory.
Yeah,
I think it helps to explain the Blue Fairy's relationship with water and why it might be a natural enemy of the Rot God. So the Blue Fairy gave the Blind Swordsman a flowing sword, and he fought with the power of flowing water to seal away the Rot God. But what's unclear here is how exactly the Scarlet Rot God was sealed away by the Blind Swordsman. Did he, sword in hand, battle a great scorpion boss in one-on-one combat and just seal its essence away? Or was their battle more of an abstract one, where the Eternal City dams were built and rivers were rerouted to encircle the Rot and contain it underground, or something like that?
Yeah, that makes sense.
These details are left to your imagination, but one way or another, the Scarlet Rot God was sealed away, but it was not defeated, and eventually it would return. And this time, it would do so in an Empyrean vessel, corrupting Malenia,
probably the most powerful vessel it's had
at the very
since
moment of her birth.
An outer god. I was going to say, I love how the outer gods and their powers are often like existing parts of life, whether it's rot,
like her brother
death,
Mikola, Malenia was born an Empyrean.
Going crazy,
Empyrean,
like some kind of
meaning
affliction.
She was essentially a valid candidate to replace Queen Marika as a god, and as such it seems she was a ripe candidate for an outer god's meddling. And it's unclear how the Rot God afflicted Malenia as soon as she was born, but it did, and that's a shame, because Malenia's great rune does state that it should have been the most sacred great rune of them all, were it not for what I assume was the Rot God's meddling. And speaking of great runes, In the sister video to this one, we talk about how Miquella was essentially the flip side to Malenia in many ways, especially in cut content where the twins were born of an inseparable fate and said to hold the runes of both abundance and decay between them. And to reflect this duality, it seems, Miquella is in this constant state of overflowing abundance, while Malenia was in this constant state of overflowing death. Essentially, we sort of see this tragedy unfolding in a few statues of Malenia, since you can see back then she did actually have all her limbs once upon a time, until the rot continued to take hold, moving her inexorably towards her inevitable death and rebirth as well.
Yeah.
And that must have felt
as the
inevitable.
Would have wanted.
It seems like in these early days there were few known ways to ward off the rot. Fire was probably the obvious one, and then there was also the act of consecration, which was used, which is essentially the act of declaring something as sacred, which was done to the weaponry of Malenia and her knights, and apparently it helped their armaments, at least, to resist the rot. But their flesh was still susceptible. Malenia's knights were therefore called the Clean Rot Knights, and they vowed to fight alongside Malenia despite the inevitable, if gradual, putrefaction of their flesh.
Damn.
And it was this fact that made these warriors so fierce, for they had basically already accepted their terrible fate, and so logically they had nothing else to lose in battle. These knights were bestowed the winged sword insignia, given only to those who fought alongside Malenia the Severed. Interestingly, this is the only item that gives Malenia the title the Severed, and I assume that it's referencing a time where Malenia was known for her prowess despite her fragmented body, as it's called in the Japanese. And I guess it's possible that she wasn't yet known as the Blade of Miquella at the time, though that's just my own speculation.
Okay, so that
At any rate, Malenia Blade of Miquella is her most common title, and it's easy to see why she would dedicate herself to her brother so fully.
She loved her brother.
For her brother was so dismayed by her condition that he dedicated himself to finding a treatment for the rot, and this search for a cure dramatically affected Miquella's worldview. For instance, he was formerly a faithful fundamentalist of the Golden Order,
following his
with
father's
all the magic to boot,
teachings.
but he would abandon those practices as they could do nothing to treat his sister's accursed rot. Instead, he pursued a path of unalloyed gold, and he crafted for Malenia a needle that could be inserted into her flesh, granting relief from the rot and preventing the progression of the rotting sickness. If you're interested in why unalloyed gold was able to do this and work that way, then I'd recommend you check out this video afterwards, which talks at length about Miquella. But we learn about the needle's specific effects in-game when we give it to a character called Millicent, who is also suffering from the Scarlet Rot. Millicent is this great parallel to Malenia that teaches us so much about what Malenia might have felt or experienced. Millicent too has lost a limb, and she is also losing her memories, and when we find her, she is unable to even move. But as soon as we give her the needle, she's able to function and fight once more. Therefore, it's fair to assume that similar benefits were conferred upon Malenia when her brother gave her the needle. It's also worth noting that the multiple needles that we find in-game, they aren't finished. Even the final version of this needle can only be used in the storm beyond time at Farum Azula, where it allows you to cheat fate, essentially. And that makes sense here, because you're outside of time in this place, so maybe you can prevent these afflictions from the outer gods before they even happen.
Wow.
So perhaps if Miquella had been able to imbue his needle with some time-warping capabilities, he could have eventually undone the effects of the rot god entirely, but again, the needle was unfortunately never finished. The needle isn't all that Miquella created with unalloyed gold. He also crafted for his sister a prosthetic arm, leg, helmet and armor of unalloyed gold, which, again, like Millicent, surely allowed her to overcome her one-armed shortcoming and reach for newer heights as a fighter. So Malenia's prospects were already looking up, but things didn't end there. For Malenia would go on to meet a man who would become her mentor, and he would give her this final, invaluable tool that could be employed against the Scarlet Rot. We see their meeting play out on this image of the prosthesis wearer heirloom, which depicts a scene from a heroic tale. You can even see Malenia's prosthetic arm and leg in this image if you look closely, which is why I assume that this meeting took place after Mikola's intervention with all of the unalloyed gold prosthetics.
Right.
So her mentor was, as you might have guessed, the blind swordsman, the man who first sealed away the Rot all those years ago, the very same. And after encountering her mentor and his flowing blade, she gained wings of unparalleled strength. This meeting says a lot about the blind swordsman. He must have known that Malenia was basically inhabited by his ancient enemy,
but
and yet
he was
doesn't
like
attempt to kill her here. Instead, he takes her under his wing and
so
teaches her
of him.
techniques that he himself once used to curtail the Rot in the first place.
That's where her infamous move comes from.
It's a wise thing to do, and perhaps we shouldn't expect any less from someone who was able to defeat an outer god in the first place. So this is why the skill on Malenia's blade is called the Waterfowl Dance. This is why Malenia recovers health by attacking during her boss fight.
So we all have to blame the blind swordsman.
The damage of the Rot was offset, and Malenia was able to achieve unparalleled strength and to maintain her pride. But it was that same pride that she would abandon in her fight with Rodan.
Okay, so we're getting into why this occurred in the first place. Star Scourge Rodan.
Rodan was born of Queen Renala, who was the Queen of Caria, and King Consort Radagon, who was previously a great champion of the Erd Tree. Thus was the Order of the Moon and the Erd Tree conjoined. And while Rodan was a true Carian, and certainly proficient in the art of sorcery, we can see in his character an inclination towards another path, an aspiration to be like Godfrey, for example, who was the first Elden Lord, and also his father Radagon, who would become the second Elden Lord. Caria was,
both of them married to his mum.
A largely
not his mum.
Society,
His
meaning
stepmom
that power was passed
dad.
down to the princesses in the family. So perhaps it's no surprise that Rodan was not as motivated by his Carian heritage
the Carian
compared
part.
to his sister
Because
Ranni,
he couldn't
for
succeed
instance.
in that
So
way as
Rodan's
much.
set was decorated with a golden lion that symbolized Godfrey and his beast Regent, and it states that from his youngest years, Rodan was naturally captivated by the Lord of the battlefield. Then his golden helmet was designed with his flaming red hair in mind, which Rodan inherited from his father, drawing attention to the fact that he was fond of the heroic implications of being Radagon's son.
So he wasn't ashamed of being
were fittingly known as the
Radagon's
Red
son.
Mane, which conflates Rodan's red hair with the mane of Godfrey's lion, and Rodan was even quoted as saying, "I was born a champion's cub, now I am the lord of the battlefield's lion," which borders on being a statement of complete loyalty to Godfrey and the Golden Order.
But he was always
we'll get to that
destined to
debate
be
a little bit later.
aligned with him.
So, naturally, this was a guy who reveled in the art of warfare, and even in his youth as a Carian royal, it seems Rodan was already a renowned general. We can infer this because of a man named Jeren. The Eccentric's armor specifically says that after spending time as a guest of the Carian royals, he became a guest commander for General Rodan. Therefore, Rodan must have still been in close contact with his Carian family, as Jeren met Rodan through these Carian royals. And when they did meet, Jeren and Rodan seemed to immediately share a certain bond, for despite Jeren preferring to have a nomadic existence, he decided to become a guest commander for General Rodan. And then, despite the temporary implication of such a title, Jeren, this restless tumbleweed, as he was called, would become bound by honorable oath, and he and Rodan swore a vow of honorable death to one another, promising that they would die honorably in battle, even if it was death by the other's hand. So it's not stated which battles that Rodan was fighting at the time, nor which war he required a new guest commander for, But then the world was very different at the time, and there's so much of the Lands Between's history that we don't know about. So I guess it's possible that the battles were being fought for distant lands like Limgrave and Caelid. The Limgrave East map does say, after all, that this path here was trod by many a soldier in the past. Maybe Rodan's forces took this path as well? And this was before Caelid was even afflicted with the Scarlet Rot.
Right, so it was a different place
things
at the
might
time.
have looked really different here,
Wow.
although admittedly we do have this shot from this trailer that shows that it still kind of looks a bit like a red hellscape here, with the red sky.
Yeah.
This was technically before the Scarlet Rot took hold. Caelid did still have some culture to boast of, though. For example, in the very middle of Caelid, there is, or was, a town of sorcery called Celia.
Yeah.
And despite Rodan's relationship with Caria and Briar Lucaria as well, presumably, it was here in Celia that he studied, learning gravitational magics that likely could not be taught anywhere else. He did this, as the story goes, all so he would never have to abandon his beloved but scrawny steed. For gravitational magics could relieve the weight of Rodan and allow his scrawny horse to carry him evermore.
This poor
Also,
horse.
in case you don't know, the horse's name is Leonard, according to
Leonard?
data, so that is the name that we're going to use.
All right.
Forward.
Poor
And
Leonard.
What's interesting about Leonard is that he's specifically called out as being scrawny, as if that's the reason why he can't carry Rodan, who is enormous. Shouldn't Rodan's size be the reason why he can't ride his horse? So I think, personally, that Rodan actually didn't become as large as he is for a very long time, and I think there's some good evidence to back that up. For one, his throne in Leyndell is of regular size. Two, his portrait is of a simple grown man, and lastly, we see a brief shot of Rodan fighting in this image where he barely even matches Morgoth in size. So personally, I think that Rodan probably only grew in size when he acquired a great rune. Regardless, at this stage anyway, it's clear that Rodan initially learned gravitational magic for the sake of his horse, but that gravitational skill set would certainly come in handy as the years went on. For one, these gravitational magics were passed on to some of his elite soldiers, like Ogre, who was the longest-serving member of the Redmane Knights, who studied techniques to manipulate gravity alongside Rodan. The equipment and the skill sets of the Redmane Knights really were very inspired by Rodan. For example, the surcoat of Rodan's Redmane Knights depicts a red-maned lion raising a sword in the image of Rodan. All of them proved that they were worthy of the Redmane name. Even their great shield's design takes that symbolism further, being shaped like a fang and featuring the crest of a red-maned lion. And these knights were strong, like Rodan too, with descriptions stating that they were reputed to be masterful warriors, and it was popularly said that the Redmanes knew no weakness. But for all of their prowess in battle, a conflict was coming that no military strength could ward away. And I'm not talking about the Scarlet Rot, I'm talking about the stars. But luckily, for this upcoming conflict, Rodan was able to solicit the help of an extremely knowledgeable teacher. According to the Gravity Well sorcery, Rodan's master was an alabaster lord with skin of stone, and these onyx and alabaster lords were a different race entirely to humans, and were said to have risen to life when a meteor struck long ago. And the meteorite sorcery tells us that the reason they were called lords was in reverential fear of their destructive power. And it seems like Rodan was soliciting their help because a similarly meteoric destructive power was on its way to Celia. So earlier we established that he explicitly did learn gravitational magic so that he could ride his horse, but the collapsing stars sorcery also explicitly says that he learned gravitational techniques so that he could challenge the stars, which I think suggests that there were two distinct periods of learning here for Rodan. Learning for the sake of his horse, and then learning for the sake of keeping Celia safe. And there's also quite a bit of evidence that suggests that Rodan's actions here were in defense. For example, the sword gravestone in Caelid specifically tells us that Rodan held Celia secure. The Star Scourge heirloom tells us that Rodan confronted the falling stars.
So
as
the
if
stars
they
were a threat
were
to
the
Celia.
aggressors. Finally, this event was also called the Star-Scourge conflict, suggesting that there was a clash of some kind here, like a back and forth, if you will. So Rodan seemed to anticipate that this event was coming, but I guess that isn't so strange when you consider that Rodan was of Carian lineage, who were renowned for reading fate in the stars.
Yeah,
so
being able
I would
to
think
read
that
the stars in
anticipating
that way.
a starfall would be pretty straightforward for them, and I think it would make sense that Rodan would want to intervene if it was headed for Celia, which is where he learned his magic from in the first place. So Rodan took defensive measures. And I guess you might argue that he even went a bit overboard, for he didn't just defend Celia from the falling stars, he actually sealed the stars' movements completely.
Altogether, yeah.
So after Rodan challenged the stars, the fate in the night sky was said to be no more.
Yeah.
And this manifests
Stop
quite
moving.
literally in Ranni's questline, for example, where Rodan has to be killed so that the stars can be unfrozen, so that one of them can literally smash into Limgrave and open a path to Nokron. If not for Rodan, I feel like a star would have smashed through Celia instead and opened a path to Nokron that way.
Oh, through Celia.
The eternal city of Nokron is said, after all, to sleep
Be
below
physically
Celia.
above.
So
why
Rodan
didn't it crash
really
into Celia
might have
then?
intervened
If
here
they
at the very
resumed?
last moment, since a star is released and hits Limgrave as soon as you kill Rodan.
Yeah.
Though I'll admit that it is a bit strange that that star hits Limgrave and not Celia.
That's what I'm saying.
Which he was set to defend.
Huh.
I wonder why.
I wonder what changed
there's
that.
one more thing I want to talk about here.
That fate,
and it's
almost.
that you could also make the argument that Rodan might have intervened at Celia and frozen the stars on behalf of the Golden Order. After all, the telescope item description literally says that the fate once writ in the night skies was fettered by the Golden Order. And Rodan was a fanboy of Radigan and Godfrey, who were two proponents of the Golden Order, so
fanboy is
definitely
crazy.
possible that he did this on the Golden Order's behalf. Personally, though, I think that both things can be true. I think
at the
that
same time.
Rodan was clearly motivated to defend Celia from Starfall, and I think that the Golden Order did stand to benefit from one of its vassals achieving such a feat.
So he was happy
Rodan,
to be the one
and
to do
most of
so.
the demigods at that stage, for that matter, were technically on the side of Marika's Golden Order. So I guess technically Rodan was aligned with the Golden Order and could have fettered the stars on their behalf.
Yeah.
Technically. But the impression
He would have
that
done it
I get
regardless,
from Rodan
even if
is
the
that
Golden Order
he
didn't
has
want
no
that.
real loyalty to anyone other than himself and his men. This is my speculation, but I think this because he's not really hated by anyone in the current age or anyone in game.
Yeah.
Even his brother Rykard has his picture up on the wall, and Rykard famously hated anything to do with the Golden Order. So while I think Rodan served the intent of the Golden Order, I don't think he was beholden to it.
Yeah, okay, he was
Especially
happy to
not
do
in the
things
later
against
years
it
when the
sometimes.
Elden Ring was shattered. Because remember this cutscene with Morgoth?
Willful traitors. All.
Morgoth labels all of the demigods as traitors to the Golden Order, including Rodan,
Including Rodan,
who we
yeah.
do see in a clash with Morgoth, suggesting that he might have abandoned his loyalty to Order and marched on Leyndell after the shattering. For Rodan, like his demigod kin, had claimed a great rune. And it's easy to assume that a warmonger like him would have had great ambitions for power, and might have even aspired to become Elden Lord. And it's around this time, when the demigods were clashing, that Malenia enters the picture. once more.
Here we
Because
go.
Malenia, Blade of Mikula, was marching towards Caelid.
Why?
Past Godric in Limgrave, and towards Rodan.
Okay. Let's freaking go. A southward march.
Honestly, Godric's nothing more than a jumped-up country bumpkin. Lord? Oh, don't make me laugh. First, he hid himself amongst the womenfolk to flee the capital, then hid from Rodan in that castle. Then he insulted Malenia, lost to her in battle, only to lick her boots rather than die like a man. Huh. Has he no shame? The big girl's blouse?
Interesting.
This dialogue from Kenneth Haidt is a great piece of lore as it tells us about this crucial late part of the Shattering War. At this point, Godric had just failed to usurp Lanedale capital and had fled with his tail between his legs to Stormvale. Here, he hid in fear of Rodan, who was a close neighbor in Caelid.
Malenia?
And it makes sense that he'd fear Rodan, who was considered by many to be the strongest of the demigods. But while he was hiding here, a different army approached. From the north, not the south, as Godric must have feared. Malenia and her Cleanrot knights were passing Stormvale on their southwards march from the Halig Tree to Caelid. And this event, this passing, is marked at the Leonia Highway sword gravestones, which state, "Nothing will hinder the wings of the blade of Miquella and the Cleanrot knights." These gravestones tend to mark points of battle, and Kenneth does state that Godric insulted Malenia and lost to her in battle. So I assume this is where that happened. As to the nature of the insult, well, we have cut dialogue from Godric to help us out here.
There is only one tree, and only its branches, that bathe in true rays of gold. Not the fool-omened king, nor the rank malformed twins.
So Godric considered Miquella and Malenia rank and malformed. So I assume the insult was along those lines, which was not smart.
Against
part.
the Halig Tree.
Malenia must have messed him up, but
that she
tellingly,
revered
did
so
not
much
kill
by
him.
Miquella.
And that's a curious detail, because this was the Shattering War. We're supposed to believe that all of the demigods were fighting for power, but if Malenia was seeking power here and looking for others' great runes to acquire in order to restore the Elden Ring and live up to Miquella or her own Empyrean promise, then you'd think that she would have killed Godric, that she wouldn't have shown him mercy. But instead, she lets him live. So, to me, that suggests that Malenia might not have been on this southward march to take power. Because if she didn't claim Godric's great rune, then she probably wasn't here for Rodan's either. So why then? Why did Malenia come full force towards Rodan on this southward march? I feel like there are 3 options. 4 if you count the theory that Malenia might have chased down Rodan in order to get control of the Elden Ring, but as I've just explained, I feel like that's unlikely. Option 2, although it's still unlikely in my opinion, is that Malenia might have sought out Rodan simply for the sake of fighting him. He was, after all, widely considered the mightiest of the demigods,
she likes
as was
to fight.
Malenia in many cases, so it's not ridiculous to think that both of them might have fought simply for the sake of pitting their strength against one another, but that's a pretty unsatisfactory answer, in my opinion.
Doesn't paint
Option
a full
3,
picture.
I feel, could be because Malenia was looking for her brother. At this point, Miquella could have already been stolen
snatched
away
out
by
of,
Mode, so perhaps she was simply looking for him.
That's a cool theory.
Pretty intentionally makes a beeline towards the south and towards Caelid, and Mohg's palace is essentially underneath Celia and underneath the area where Rodan and Malenia fought.
Maybe she could sense that he was in
Guess
that
it's possible
area.
that Malenia had some intel leading her here in a search for Miquella.
Interesting.
But again, this is only speculation.
I
My
like
favorite
that
theory is the
idea.
4th one, which is that Malenia and by extension Miquella may have wanted Rodan dead for the same reason that Ranni eventually does, so that the stars could resume their movement.
Maybe she thought
bringing
that would
certain
allow
fates
Miquella to
back into
return.
play. And you might be asking, but why would Miquella want the stars to resume their movement? Well, perhaps Miquella's own fate was locked in stasis. We do find a demigod's amber starlight shard in Miquella's hideaway, after all. And
Or at least
I
that
feel
could
like
be
it
what
should be
Malenia
concerning
thought, is that his fate was bound.
might have fallen like this. But the best answer, I think, is that Miquella wanted the stars back in motion so that the moon could properly eclipse the sun. This was a ritual that Miquella seemed to believe would revive Godwyn the Golden, his brother. And we talk about this a lot more in this video, and I can definitely see how the stars being in stasis would prevent the moon from eclipsing the sun. So I really like this answer.
Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense,
I'd love to hear
actually.
your theories. Surely there's more than just these 4 options. But in the end, there's only really one answer that I'm confident in, and it's that we can't confidently say for sure why Malenia fought.
I like those last 2 theories a lot, I think.
But
that makes
whatever
a
the
lot of
reason,
sense.
it must have been a good one, because it was during this
It would
battle
have been something Mikola would have wanted for
Malenia
the stars,
sacrificed everything.
and something Malenia would have wanted to get closer to and find Mikola. That's really fascinating.
There is something I must return to Malenia. The will that was once her own. The dignity. The sense of self that allowed her to resist the call of the Scarlet Rot, the pride she abandoned, to meet Rodan's measure.
In Elden Ring's story trailers, we see this legendary fight play out. Cleanrot Knights finally arrive with Malenia facing off against the Redmane Knights and manage to plunge a ton of spears into Rodan during their clash. You can actually see these spears still sticking out of his back to this day.
That's cool.
Then Malenia and Rodan appear to be the only two left standing. Malenia sacrifices her prosthetic arm to get close to Rodan, grabbing her blade and plunging it into both of them, giving us a close-up view of the two characters. Here, Rodan looks monstrous, which I theorize could again be because he's tainted with the madness of a great rune, though that is just speculation. And we can also see Malenia's lips moving here, muttering some final words, or perhaps the incantation for the Scarlet Aeonia, which envelops herself and Rodan, putting an end to their fight. In this video's first chapter, we talked extensively about Malenia's battle against the Scarlet Rot within her, but in this moment, she seems to lose that fight, maybe intentionally, and she allows the Scarlet Rot to take hold. Millicent, who is a great parallel to Malenia, says that this is when she sacrificed her dignity, her sense of self, her will, and her pride. Malenia did all of this just so that she could meet Rodan's measure. Thus did the Scarlet Rot explode outwards,
so that
infecting Rodan
she could
and
help
the very
Mikola.
land itself, as their battle came to a horrific standstill.
She was probably...
In the end, neither party was in a state to continue fighting.
She was probably ready to risk it.
Technically, Malenia didn't lose, so she was technically still undefeated.
She was ready to risk her rot
the battle of
exacerbating.
But one who did was the Cleanrot Knight
have
Finlay,
stars
who,
continue, but they
in
didn't
an
continue.
unimaginable act of heroism, carried the slumbering form of Malenia all the way back to the Halig Tree. They managed this alone, fending off all manner of foes along the way. But back at the center of Caelid, Malenia's scarlet bloom remained. A nearby phantom's dialogue reads, "Sublime, I tell you. The very first flower of Aeonia bloomed on this very spot. Malenia, may you blossom into a goddess." In the present day, Caelid features at its center a giant tree that spirals in a similar manner to Malenia's first scarlet bloom, so it probably is the same scarlet bloom. As the Phantom says, this was the very first flower of Aeonia, and the beginning of the Scarlet Swamp in this land. And at the very center of that is another curious thing. There's a boss called Commander O'Neill, who carries the Commander's Standard, which reads, "Even after his lord was fled, Commander O'Neill continued to brandish this flag in the devastation of the rot-eaten field of battle, the sole veteran who remembers this battle with pride." And it's hard for me to say exactly whose side O'Neill would have been on. He summons the spirits of exiled soldiers, who themselves have no real affiliation to speak of. Though I will say that you can summon one of Millicent's sisters to help you in the fight against O'Neill, which might suggest that he's opposed to the idea of rot, and that he might have fought for Rodan, although I feel like you could go both ways on this, because the Commander's Standard says that his lord was fled, and both Malenia and Rodan fled this battle. Anyway, when you defeat O'Neill,
I think he's with Rodan,
him into the guises of Scarlet Rot because it's funny, he doesn't just drop the Commander's Standard, he also drops an heirloom of the Battle of Aeonia, a broken needle of unalloyed gold that was once buried within Malenia's own flesh, repelling her Scarlet Rot until it snapped. A really interesting question here, considering the needle is broken, is whether Malenia snapped the needle intentionally when she plunged her blade into herself and Rodan. Perhaps she knew that it would cause the rot within her to flare up worse than ever if the needle was broken, and allow her to defeat Rodan. Millicent does explain that the explosion of rot in her is worse after she takes out the needle. Almost as if it's been building up inside them all this time.
100%. I think that's so likely.
To even tell you, but I took out the needle myself. The Scarlet Rot writhes now, worse than ever.
So it's pretty clear that this is where the final moments of the battle took
and
place.
I feel like Malenia purposely did that
able to rise outside when
to
you're
inflict
near,
it and
even
have
now.
things
But then
progress
we don't find Rodan
for the
anywhere
sake of
near
Nicola.
here. Instead, we find him closer to his former home at Redmane Castle. In a nearby catacomb, the spirits of the war dead actually continue to clash, refusing to surrender, even in death. And outside, Rodan is exactly the same way. And while witless, he's still alive. Even
he's like
managing to keep
this
the stars in
madness.
stasis, even now, for he's still in possession of his great rune, which itself started to burn to resist the encroachment of the Scarlet Rot. His feet have rotten off, the spears of Clean Rot Knights remain in his flesh, but he fights on, simply using those spears in his back as arrows to fight off anyone who threatens him, refusing to give up and die in anything but an honorable death.
And we gave it to him. We gave him that. Everything's rotting scarlet.
Are you one for festivals or flowers? To the south, a grand festival to make the stars turn. To the east, the hardened bud of a flower to be. But dare you enter into the heart of the Scarlet Rot?
As the rot takes hold, Caelid becomes a fresh hell.
A wasteland.
The land itself becomes a threat. Even the dragons in this place were forced to flee, and they would make a new nest on a plateau that would be dubbed Dragon Barrow, and no one since then has dared to enter it. That said, a few dragons did not make it away unscathed. The dragon Exekies succumbed to the Scarlet Rot,
and he was
though
like
he did not forget his hatred, and sadly,
fleshy
Grail,
and
the
gross.
mother of all dragons, who dwarfs them all as well, can be found on death's door surrounded by her children and completely blighted
couldn't
by
move.
the Scarlet Rot. Kind of sad.
It is
Thanks for the
sad. You had to
50k
kill her
views, though.
kids to
And in the
kill
end,
her.
it was Malenia's Scarlet Rot, not really Malenia herself, that would eventually drive Rodan's Redmane Knights to defeat. According to their armor, when they were driven to defeat by Malenia's Scarlet Rot, the Redmane Knights burned off the crest on the left breast of their armor to indicate their resolve, stating, "Alas, dear home, I shan't see you again, for our duty is to remain here, a bulwark against the blight." The knights using fire to burn away their own crest in this way is such a great symbol, for fire was their one and only weapon for fighting back against the rot.
That's all they
And
had.
interestingly, according to the Armorer's Cookbook, a lot of these tools and techniques to do with fire were passed down by an armorer who served the great General Rodan, as his books contain knowledge of dealing with rot, the application of fire in particular. And so, this flame
That's
of
what
the
they
Red
continued
Manes
with.
clearly became a large part of their identity henceforth. Corpses of rabid wildlife were piled high and burned. Long smouldering
prevent
walls
it
of
from
flame were built
spreading.
in order to prevent the rot from spreading to neighboring lands. These same walls border their own castles. They burnt down churches, and they even managed to commandeer some flame chariots to help in their fight. They utilized torches, firepots, arrows, everything.
Everything flammable.
Fittingly, Knight Geren's beloved sword, a flamberge, became the symbol of the castle itself, thanks to the flame-like undulation that gives this sword its difficult-to-pronounce name. Jeren himself remained at Redmane Castle to regularly host a celebration of war, calling champions from far and wide to deliver
To
death,
take on
a
Rodan.
death for his friend,
A deserved
who
death.
is now festering with rot and crippled by madness,
Yeah.
who now only wishes
He went
for
cray-cray.
an honourable way out.
Yeah.
Meanwhile,
Because he made that
amidst
promise. He had
Malenia's
to.
Aeonian butterflies, pale pests emerge from the swamp of Aeonia. And though they appear to be mere bugs, they're not. These creatures are intelligent, with a quote-unquote keen intellect that allows them to craft uncanny weaponry from sharpened shell. They can incant spells as well, and they can even tame wild beasts. That said, they are ultimately creatures of worship.
Yes,
and
they worship
Gowry
the
actually
rot.
calls them witless, which admittedly does contrast with them being described as intelligent in this item description. Regardless, the pests are also called the abandoned children of the goddess and servants of the goddess of Rot, who have been forsaken. And it's not hard to see why. Not only was Malenia carried far away at the very moment of her bloom when these pests allegedly emerged,
right,
but
so they were
she
like
resents
birthed from
and
that.
resists the Scarlet Rot inside her unless she's pushed to the absolute brink. So, of course, these pests are abandoned in that sense as well. And who wouldn't hate them, honestly? Is there anything more annoying than this bloody attack?
Correct.
Nevertheless, the pests persist. They even have a quotable line of dialogue in the Kindred of Rot's exaltation talisman, which reads, "Rot for the Scarlet Goddess. O scarlet blossoms, flourish in distant lands, and return to us the unwanted
Yeah, because they were
children."
technically children of her.
Which brings
They,
us to the
that
phrase,
move birthed
Scarlet
them.
Blossoms. This might not be talking about literal flower buds of the Scarlet Rot, but instead I think it's talking about actual people. I think it's talking about these 5 sisters. I think these are the Scarlet Blossoms.
The
They
daughters
are
of...
Pollyanna, Maureen, Amy, Mary, and Millicent.
The girl, Millicent, she is a bud. Green and undeveloped, waiting to flower into magnificence. What a wondrous day that will be. In truth, before her, I'd never seen a bud of such superior quality. She might very well outshine her sisters.
So it seems like these pests, including Gowry perhaps, have a keen interest in cultivating these Scarlet Blossoms. I'd prefer to talk about Millicent's questline in a future Prepare to Cry episode, so subscribe and turn on notifications, but I will hold off for now. But essentially, Gowry does all of this in anticipation of these daughters becoming Scarlet Valkyries, who he believes might one day serve Malenia when she ascends as the goddess of Rot.
The Shaded Castle.
At this point, Malenia hadn't been seen for a long while, not since she was carried off to the Halig Tree, and the Halig Tree's location itself was a mystery to many. But there were still those who venerated and worshipped her, and they weren't all pests. Some of them were human, like Marai, the Castellan of the Shaded Castle. Marai wears the Marai mask, which is something only worn by the head of House Marai. It bears the likeness of the first of their line, and it describes this long dual history of the Marai family, who served as both executioners and castellans of the Shaded Castle. So fittingly, their storied sword is the Marai Executioner's Sword, a broad-bladed weapon that would eventually be used against them. For one day, they made the mistake of capturing a bell-bearing hunter named Elima, but Elima, who knew battle skills that allowed him to move objects with his very own will, snatched the sword from the site of his looming execution and overthrew his captors. But it doesn't seem like he wanted to rule over the castle in their stead. Instead, the castle falls into ruin, and when we find him, Elima is just standing and staring at an enormous portrait, which is a picture of Malenia, who some believe is to blame for the fate of the castle. A nearby phantom laments the state of things and states, "House Marai is ruined, just deserts for falling for that severed harpy. No surprise that guilty cretin took the castle and our storied sword." In the outskirts of the castle, you can actually find and fight Marai,
Really?
a former castellan of the castle who
never
has
did
now
that.
been ousted. He wields the Ant Spur Rapier, which is a weapon that evokes the scorpion dagger that we mentioned at the start of the video, as it's
look
also
similar.
a blade fashioned from a chitinous creature. In this case, it's the spur of a giant ant. Fittingly then, its description reminds us that Scarlet Rot is an old legend, and goes on to state that Marai of the Shaded Castle was a private believer in the Scarlet Rot, and indeed, he eventually found his own personal goddess. The Marai robe explains why he was so enamored with her, stating that the sons of House Marai are all sickly born, and so Marai was beguiled by the beautiful and fierce goddess who was born into Rot. Malenia was, after all, a powerful and fierce figure in spite of her affliction, so it's easy to see why Marai looked up to her. Though I guess it's possible that he took this veneration too far, as the castle is found sinking into a poison swamp, and the throne room is filled with prosthetics which mirror Malenia's own. Indeed, it's
like
possible that he even found Malenia's very own prosthetic, as you can loot the Valkyrie's prosthesis here, which reads, "Golden prosthesis once used by the one-armed Valkyrie, a masterwork of craftsmanship. With practice and skill, it can be used as proficiently as a real arm." When Marai, Lord of the Shaded Castle, embraced this prosthesis, he claimed to feel the presence of his personal goddess.
He was like very obsessed.
I'm not really sure if this is Malenia's actual prosthesis or not. I feel like you could make debates for and against that, but regardless, it drives home just how much of a fanboy this guy was. But in the end, the castle is not much more now than just a home for some surviving Clean Rot Knights who would understandably feel at home in such a place. And I guess they have nowhere else to go as Malenia slumbers back at the Halig Tree, where she does very little else until you arrive and trigger what I think is her second transformation.
Malenia, Goddess of Rot.
Wait. The scarlet bloom flowers once more. You will witness true horror. Now, rot.
Now, I got some bad news for you guys in this final chapter. So, you know how difficult Malenia was to defeat?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, what if I told you that wasn't her final form?
Oh, great.
It might not be, for the Scarlet Aeonia description reads, "Each time the scarlet flower blooms, Malenia's rot advances, and with the third bloom, she will become a true goddess." So
this was
it's
only her
known
second
that Malenia's
time when
first
she
bloom
fought us.
was in Caelid, and we know that she blooms in a fight against us. So the debate
dear.
becomes, is this mid-fight bloom Malenia's second bloom, or her third?
Interesting.
Some would argue that this is Malenia's third bloom,
because she
and that
looks like
she's
a
already
goddess
become
there.
the Goddess of Rot. She does, after all, literally have Goddess of Rot as her title, and there is a bloom right outside her boss room which could have been the site of her second bloom.
Okay.
So how do you argue against that? Well, for starters, the bloom outside might not be hers.
And it's
For
very
one,
small.
it'd be kind of weird if she had a second bloom that is never described, right here, when she's slumbering in just the neighboring room. But not only that, in front of this bloom, you actually loot the Traveler's set, which is the same set worn by Millicent and her sisters, and Melanie as well.
One of the sisters
Considering
could have done
Millicent
that.
and her sisters are buds of Malenia, and considering Millicent also leaves behind one of these blooms when she dies, it's not ridiculous to think that
It's
one of
the other
these sisters
sisters.
might have flowered here already. And I don't think that Malenia having Goddess of Rot in her boss title means that much. Many, like Gowry and the Pests, already believe that Malenia is the Goddess of Rot. The Scarlet Aeonia description instead specifies that the third bloom will make her a true goddess. And
Right.
I think anything
Okay.
before that is just a brief flash of the Rot god shining through. But the
That she
biggest piece
can
of
be.
evidence that Malenia hasn't yet reached her third bloom yet, in my opinion, comes from Gowry, who goes to extraordinary lengths to nurture Millicent, encouraging us to kill her even, just so this betrayal can turn her into a Scarlet Valkyrie that will serve Malenia.
It must be done by your hand, no other. Millicent trusts you, rather deeply in fact. Sever that trust. Nurtured by betrayal, her bud will flower most vividly. When Malenia ascends to godhood, Millicent too shall be reborn as a Scarlet Valkyrie.
If
she'll
Millicent
take
dies, she flowers, with Gowry's expectation being that she will be revived after this. So considering that there's a bloom in Malenia's boss room as well that appears after you defeat her, I feel like it's possible that Malenia could have another revivification after this as well.
That'd be crazy.
One final piece of evidence was actually pointed out by you guys in the comments of my recent Oracle short. In that video, I argued that the Oracles might be there to herald the return of Mikla as a god, as their spirit ashes state that it is said that when Oracle envoys appear playing their pipes, they do so to herald the arrival of a new god or age. But I completely neglected to mention that they might be here to herald Malenia's ascension as a god instead.
Into god.
So thank you guys for pointing that out. If you haven't already, I'd appreciate if you tried out some of my shorts content. It's extremely difficult to fit everything within 60 seconds, but it's a fun challenge and I'm pretty happy with some of the short stories that I've been able to tell in those shorts. Anyway, personally, I wouldn't be surprised if we fight some incarnation
A
of
harder
Malenia
version?
again in the DLC.
Don't do that.
And I'd be down for that fight, provided she rises again with her lower half as a scorpion or something.
Ooh,
But what I
yeah,
find to be the most
scorpionified.
disturbing thought about Malenia's potential third bloom is that Gowry believes a scarlet bloom will be more vivid if it's nurtured by betrayal. That's what we see in Millicent's questline. So what if Malenia's third bloom could be more vivid if she's betrayed by her brother, Mikla? But it's late now,
But would
and
Rogue
I'm really getting into some deranged
had that
speculation
intention?
territory, aren't I? So that's probably my cue to end the video.
Oh god, I
Special thanks
wonder.
to Mispat for the footage and editing help, as always.
'Cause I don't know if
And
it's
special
part of
thanks to
Mikla's plan or
Quaylark
not.
as well for looking over this script. And thank you, as always, for watching.
Wowie. Okay, so dang. So that is very interesting then, because I don't know then if Mikla is going to feel like he has to betray her for her, because what she did was she sacrificed the needle in that fight with Rodan to exacerbate her rot, since Mikla had helped prevent it. Did Mikla need to? But he was already gone by the time she'd done that. That was like a measure she had done to work her way into finding him, into getting closer to, I don't know, either setting the stars moving for the sake of Mikla or just searching Rodan for him. So either way, it was already, Mikla was lost. I don't think it was Mikla's plan, but I'm not too sure. That's what I'm going to, I'm hoping, learn in a lot of the DLC. But another thing I was wanting to mention is how much I really enjoy that the outer gods and their will or their powers all have things to do with like naturally occurring phenomena, whether it's things like rot and decay, whether it's things like just death and rebirth, whether it's things like even like madness or I guess like corruption of the mind. Like these are all like naturally occurring things that happen in nature amongst all sorts of different animals, plants, fungi, life. And that is really cool that, because a few of you had said in the comments that you think the outer will is just like elements almost. Like I like how one of them was like a meteorite that had crashed into Earth, and that's where that element of like gravity magic and stuff like that was coming from, and just different things like that. Like that's all how life exists and came to be. Certain elements that are essential for creating life just happen to have landed on Earth, like I'm talking about our world, to create these elements that come together to make life viable. In a similar way of the Elden Ring world, there was just outer gods that had the chance that they connected and collided into that world led to so many of these events occurring and snowballing into each other. So I don't know what was like planned all along by people such as Queen Marika or Mikola or the Outer Gods themselves with their will, or if things did truly happen by chance in some aspects. So that is very fascinating to me, and I'm really enjoying learning about that with you all. Alrighty everyone, thank you for watching. Be sure to leave a like, comment your thoughts at what you were experiencing when you went through going through this lore the first time and learning all about it. And yeah, thank you so much for being on this journey with me. I will see you in the next video. Bye!